Okay, let's dive into a case that is, frankly, just profoundly unsettling. It's about a missing person, a teenager, who's seemingly just, well, vanished without a trace.
Hmm.
It's the kind of mystery that really sticks with you because the lack of any definitive answers leaves this huge empty space where a life should be. And for the people left behind, well, it's a perpetual state of not knowing.
And when that person is so young, you know, only 17 years old, basically on the cusp of adulthood, that void feels particularly tragic.
Yeah.
You lose not just their present, but all the potential futures they might have had, all the experiences they'll never get to have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Today, we're focusing on the disappearance of Macin Smith. He was that 17-year-old we're talking about, who went missing from his home in St. George, Utah, way back on September 1st, 2015.
Right.
We've pulled together a pretty comprehensive stack of sources for this deep dive, reports drawing from various articles, research, police notes, family accounts that really dig into the complexities of this investigation.
Yeah, there's a lot out there. And our mission today is basically to unpack these sources with you. We want to take you through the known facts as they've been reported, explore the main theories that have circulated over the years, and, shine a light on the key unresolved questions that still hang over Mason's case.
And what makes this case particularly complex right from the jump is how the police themselves have had to approach it. It's officially classified as an active missing persons investigation by the St. George Police Department.
Hmm.
But our sources detail how, almost from the beginning, investigators have also been actively exploring criminal homicide, essentially, looking for evidence that Macin was the victim of a crime.
Exactly.
That dual focus, that lingering ambiguity, is really central to understanding the enduring mystery here.
Precisely. It tells us that investigators haven't been able to definitively rule out either a voluntary disappearance or something far more sinister. And that fundamental uncertainty is incredibly difficult for law enforcement, obviously for the family, and for anyone trying to understand what actually happened.
Let's maybe set the scene a little bit. We're talking about St. George, Utah. It's down in the southwestern corner of the state, known for its stunning red rocks, the kind of desert landscapes you see in old westerns.
Beautiful area.
Yeah, it's not a major metropolis, but it's a growing area, a place people move to for the warmer climate, for the scenery. And Mason's family had recently relocated there.
And that move itself turns out to be a pretty significant piece of the puzzle, as we'll see.
So who was Macin Smith? The sources paint a picture of a specific kind of kid, and those details feel important for understanding the context of his disappearance. Born in April of '98, he was the youngest of 6 children to Tracy and Darren Smith. He's consistently described by those who knew him as shy, sensitive, and introverted.
And these aren't just casual descriptors, right? They build a profile of a young person who might process external pressures very differently than someone else.
Yeah.
You mentioned a childhood aspiration of being a rock star, which is a fascinating contrast, isn't it?
It really is.
It suggests perhaps this deep-seated desire for an outlet for self-expression, maybe something that felt bigger or more visible than his everyday reality, even if his natural inclination was, quieter.
Right. It's that internal world maybe clashing with his external presentation. And our sources note he had a slight speech impediment from early speech therapy, which reportedly led to some bullying.
Ah, yeah. And that's another crucial piece of his history. Bullying, particularly during those formative teenage years, can deeply impact a person's self-esteem and their sense of belonging.
For sure.
For someone already inclined towards shyness and introversion, it can just reinforce those tendencies, making the outside world feel even more challenging and, well, isolating.
And his primary free time activities, as reported, were really immersed in the digital world, video games and anime.
Which for many introverted teenagers are incredibly important. They can be primary sources of social connection, online communities built around shared interests, and also a powerful form of escapism.
A refuge, almost.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a world where they might feel more comfortable, more in control, maybe able to express themselves in ways they can't in face-to-face interactions. It becomes a retreat.
Now, just a few months before Macin disappeared, in April 2015, his family had moved to St. George from Canada. And by this point, Macin was the only child still living at home with his parents.
Okay, this move is a potentially really significant factor that's highlighted in the source material. The family relocation, while intended in part to help both Macin and his mother, Tracy, with their documented struggles with depressive episodes, hoping the warmer climate might help,
Right.
it had another effect. Being the sole child left at home could have really amplified his feelings of being under the microscope.
Yeah.
of being the single focus of parental attention and potentially scrutiny.
That's a great point. Moving to a new place, leaving behind whatever familiarity and maybe friends he had in Canada, combined with being the only kid at home for a shy, introverted teenager, that's a lot of change and potential isolation all at once.
Compounding factors.
No, it introduces a new layer of pressure at a time when he was already, it seems, quite vulnerable.
Exactly. It's compounding factors.
The sources also mention a past incident that offers some real insight into how Macin coped when faced with pressure or restrictions. Back in December 2013, when they were still in Canada, he ran away from home.
Mm.
This happened after his parents had confiscated his Xbox because of declining grades.
And what's particularly noteworthy about that incident, according to the sources, is the detail provided about his actions. He apparently took a sleeping bag, food, even resumes.
Resumes, really?
Yeah. So this wasn't just an impulsive storming out in anger. It suggests it was a deliberate attempt to physically withdraw from a situation he found difficult, to escape it. A plan.
Right. It was a plan, albeit short-lived. Apparently, he returned after only a few hours because it was cold outside, but still, a planned attempt at independence and escape.
So this establishes a pattern of behavior, doesn't it? When faced with academic pressure or restrictions on his activities, specifically taking away his electronics, like the Xbox, his learned response was to use physical withdrawal or escape as a coping mechanism.
Yeah.
This pre-existing behavior becomes highly relevant when we look at the circumstances surrounding his later disappearance in 2015.
And within the family dynamics, there were clearly some tensions that played out. The parents had established rules with Macin. Good grades meant access to anime, but no electronics, like computers or phones, after 10 p.m. on school nights.
Pretty standard household rules, maybe. But the sources highlight specific tension between Macin and his father, Darren. Darren reportedly wanted Macin to get a job, to be more social, to engage more with the outside world, which apparently caused Macin to distance himself from his father.
That push for more conventional teenage activities, getting a job, socializing could easily feel like a direct challenge to an introverted personality who preferred retreating into video games and anime. It adds another layer of pressure within the home environment, potentially making Macin feel even more misunderstood or judged.
And tragically, the sources also document a history of depression, which is a critical piece of information informing any discussion about his mental state leading up to the disappearance. Macin had a prior suicide attempt at age 15, which led to hospitalization.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So this isn't just a history of sadness. It's a history of significant mental health struggles and demonstrated vulnerability to self-harm.
Okay, let's try and connect these pieces and maybe deepen the psychological context based on everything we've learned so far. We have these external pressures, the academic expectations, his father's push for him to be more social, the parental rules around electronics. And these seem to intersect directly with Macin's internal struggles, his documented history of depression, his isolation, and that learned escape behavior we just talked about.
Yes, and the way those conflicts were handled, specifically with external restrictions like confiscating electronics, seemed to almost reinforce that escape mechanism we saw in the 2013 incident.
Right.
It might have taught him, perhaps unintentionally, that when things became difficult or felt overwhelmingly controlled, physically removing himself from the situation was a viable or perhaps the only perceived option.
Now, there's a detail that was uncovered after his disappearance that adds another incredibly complex layer to his state of mind. The discovery of anime pornography on his confiscated laptop.
Right. And what's important here, and deeply sad, is how that discovery could add a significant layer of potential private shame or this crushing fear of exposure.
Oh, absolutely.
Imagine the terror of his parents finding that, especially maybe his father, who's already trying to push him towards different behaviors, different interests.
Yeah.
That could easily make the home environment feel even more suffocating, even more unbearable.
Right. It dramatically strengthens the psychological basis for the runaway theory, suggesting that escaping wasn't just about getting away from rules about curfew or anime, but potentially escaping deep personal embarrassment and the fear of judgment over something intensely private. But you also have to consider his history of depression. For someone with that vulnerability, the same psychological impulse to get away from an unbearable situation could tragically have been interpreted as ending his life, not just changing his location.
Exactly. The feeling of being trapped, exposed, and overwhelmed, combined with the history of depression, means that the concept of escape could manifest as either physically leaving or seeking a final permanent exit. This detail about the laptop adds a layer of psychological intensity to that potential tipping point. Host, speaker, speaker. So leading into the disappearance on September 1st, there was an immediate catalyst that our sources highlight. The disciplinary action involving the confiscation of his laptop and cell phone, specifically for watching anime past curfew.
Yeah.
This is presented as the critical tipping point, the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. For Macin, these devices weren't just electronics. They were his windows to a world where he felt comfortable, his primary outlets for escapism, for entertainment, and likely for whatever limited social connection he might have had online through gaming or anime communities.
So taking them away didn't just feel like a standard disciplinary action. It likely felt, from his perspective, like a profound invasion of his personal space and the sudden removal of his core coping mechanisms, his methods for managing stress and finding solace.
Right.
It wasn't just about breaking a rule about anime, it was parental control clashing directly with his deep need for autonomy and his retreat into these digital worlds that felt safe.
And when you factor in that potential context of the anime pornography being on that very same confiscated device,
Yeah.
the emotional response could have been incredibly intensified. The combination of losing his primary escape routes and facing the potential imminent exposure of something he felt deeply ashamed of. For a vulnerable teenager with a history of depression, it's understandable how that could lead him to feel completely overwhelmed, to feel irrevocably done with his current life and situation.
This suggests that the removal of his electronics, particularly in that specific context, wasn't a minor argument to be resolved the next day, but maybe the event that triggered a severe, possibly desperate reaction. It strongly bolsters the idea that his departure was either something he had planned as a last resort when faced with this ultimate restriction, or a desperate, immediate act in response to feeling completely trapped, exposed, and out of options.
It provides a really compelling psychological framework for why this specific night and morning might have been the point of no return for Macin.
Let's meticulously walk through the timeline of September 1st, 2015, and the events leading up to it the night before, as reported in the sources. On August 31st, the evening before he vanished, Macin apparently texted his mother, Tracy, mentioning he had good grades and wanted to spend the night watching anime.
Okay.
His father, Darren, suggested taking him out driving, but Macin claimed a headache and rescheduled.
Later that evening, around 8:30 p.m., Tracy got home and found Macin in bed unusually early, saying he wasn't feeling well. She reminded him about the rule regarding electronics after 10 p.m. on school nights, and before heading to bed herself, she unplugged the internet router.
Which, as we discussed, was that direct confrontation with his primary coping mechanism and source of escape. Now, the critical early morning hours. In the very early morning of September 1st, about 1:30 a.m., Darren woke up and saw a blue light coming from under Macin's bedroom door.
Huh?
He went in and found Macin awake, watching anime, having evidently replugged the internet router.
Okay, so he defied the rule, or at least the unplugging.
Seems so. At that point, Darren confiscated Macin's laptop and cell phone, taking them to his and Tracy's bedroom for the night. According to Darren's later account, Macin seemed relatively okay with this confiscation and did not physically resist.
Okay.
Then comes the morning routine. According to Darren, he checked on Macin around 7:40 a.m. and saw him getting ready for school. Both parents reportedly heard him in the kitchen around 7:30 a.m.,
Okay.
and they stated they heard the garage door close at 7:40 a.m., assuming he was heading to the bus stop, which was just a short, maybe 2-minute walk away from their home.
And Macin's school bus was scheduled for pickup right around that time, specifically at 7:41 a.m. This was their last reported knowledge of his whereabouts, basically.
Okay, here is where things get incredibly murky and have been a major focus for police scrutiny. Our sources highlight a critical timeline discrepancy centered around Darren Smith's activities that very morning.
Right?
It turns out Darren's membership card was used to check in at Vesa Fitness, a local gym, at 7:45 a.m.
Okay. And the gym was located, according to reports, approximately a 10-minute drive from their home in St. George.
So let's look at the math, as investigators surely did. To arrive at a location 10 minutes away by 7:45 a.m., Darren would have had to leave his house by roughly 7:35 a.m. at the absolute latest, right? Accounting for travel time and parking, check-in.
Yeah, at least. Maybe even a minute or two earlier to be safe.
Exactly. This creates a direct logical inconsistency with the parents' stated account of hearing Macin leave for the bus at 7:40 a.m.
Right. If Darren left at 7:35 a.m. to make the 7:45 a.m. gym check-in, he couldn't have been at the house to hear Macin leave at 7:40 a.m.
Or, if he did hear Macin leave at 7:40 a.m., the gym timestamp of 7:45 a.m. is inaccurate. Or the gym was much closer than reported. or his travel time was somehow less than 5 minutes, which seems highly unlikely given the distance.
Yeah, it just doesn't line up. This precise yet contradictory timeline for a crucial window of time has been a major focus for police investigators.
And Darren Smith has reportedly acknowledged the discrepancy, but questioned the accuracy of the gym timestamp and also, notably, questioned why his wife Tracy's similar account of hearing Macin leave wasn't doubted as much.
Interesting deflection, perhaps. And Tracy's explanation for these inconsistencies, as reported, was that their initial statements about times were simply guesstimates.
Right.
She stated they were under immense stress and shock, not paying exact attention to the clock, and certainly not anticipating a national investigation where every single minute would be scrutinized.
Which is understandable on a human level. Guesstimates are a common reaction to stress and shock, especially in the immediate aftermath of realizing your child is missing. But our sources point out that, from a police perspective, these discrepancies significantly undermine the credibility of the initial account of Macin's last known moments at home. Police have reportedly viewed these inconsistencies as more than just innocent errors or memory lapses under stress.
And this raises a really important question for the investigation. What does this critical gap and inconsistency in the recorded timeline mean? If the initial timeline provided by the people closest to Macin's, his parents, is unreliable, even unintentionally, it forces investigators to consider alternative scenarios.
Yeah.
This includes the possibility that they might have more knowledge about Macin's departure or what happened to him in that crucial window than they initially disclosed.
It doesn't automatically mean foul play, of course, but it definitely creates a vacuum of trust and complicates the entire investigation immeasurably, because the foundation of when Macin left the house becomes unstable. It introduces ambiguity that police have stated fuels suspicion, whether or not that suspicion is ultimately founded.
Precisely. If you can't rely on the initial account of the last known moment, it creates uncertainty about everything that followed and forces investigators to broaden their scope significantly.
After Macin's presumed departure that morning, the day reportedly unfolded as normal initially. Tracy went to work, and Darren reportedly stayed home to do some yard work.
Oh.
It wasn't until the afternoon that concerns started mounting. At 3:15 p.m., Macin wasn't on the school bus arriving home. By 3:30 p.m., Darren was concerned because Macin still hadn't appeared, and he had no way to contact him since his phone had been confiscated.
Right, no phone. Tracy later discovered an email notification from the school indicating Macin's absence for the entire day.
Oh.
When she got home, she found Macin's room locked, which she noted was unusual for him. While the door was locked, nothing else in the room appeared outwardly disturbed.
They checked with his church youth group, confirming he hadn't been there either. As the hours passed with no sign of him and no way to contact him, the worry obviously escalated. By 10:00 p.m. that night, they filed a missing juvenile report with the St. George Police Department.
At that initial stage, based perhaps on his history of running away and the circumstances involving the electronics confiscation, the prevailing assumption among both the parents and likely the police was that Macin had simply run away from home.
Let's talk about what Macin left behind and some significant actions he reportedly took right before he disappeared, as detailed in the source material. The sources list several items that remained at the house. His cellular phone.
The confiscated one?
Right. His wallet, any money he had, besides perhaps cash stashed elsewhere. His passport, and importantly his laptop computer, the one that had just been confiscated hours before.
Okay, this is fascinating and has been a point of intense discussion. Why would a teenager supposedly planning to run away and start a new life leave behind all of those essential items?
Exactly. Your phone is your primary link to communication and navigation. Your wallet contains identification and access to funds. Your passport is necessary for international travel.
Leaving them all behind seems incredibly counterintuitive for someone planning independent survival.
Right. It immediately makes you wonder about his intentions. Was it a deliberate act to completely sever all ties, digital and physical, and make himself untraceable? To truly disappear without a trace?
Or did it imply that wherever he was going or whatever he intended, he didn't need those things? Some speculate he might have had cash stashed elsewhere, but the complete absence of identification documents is particularly striking for a planned long-term runaway.
And then there are the actions he reportedly took right before he disappeared, which seem to paint a picture of deliberate planning rather than an impulsive act. His school supplies were discovered hidden away beneath a pile of clothes in his closet.
That detail feels highly significant, doesn't it? Hiding his school books doesn't fit with a sudden emotional storming out or an immediate impulsive act of self-harm.
No.
It feels like something you do if you want to delay people realizing you're gone, to buy yourself time, as some sources suggest.
Right. The analysis in our sources uses that exact phrase, buy him additional time for the getaway. This strongly suggests a planned departure designed to delay discovery and give him a head start.
And even more telling, he reportedly deleted his computer's search history shortly before his father confiscated it that very morning at 1:30 a.m.
Ah, okay. So before the confiscation, he wiped it.
Yes. Deleting digital footprints, wiping search history, clearing logs is a classic tactic for someone trying to disappear without a trace. It points towards a premeditated effort to evade detection and prevent anyone from seeing what he was researching or planning in those final hours.
So you have the combination of him physically hiding school books to delay discovery at home and deliberately wiping digital data to cover his tracks online. These actions, as analyzed in our sources, strongly suggest a high degree of premeditation and a clear intent to disappear, rather than an impulsive decision made in anger or an immediate act of self-harm.
It reinforces the runaway theory, but frames it not as a spontaneous escape, but as a strategic plan to sever ties and evade detection. It paints a picture of someone who was not just reacting to pressure, but actively planning an exit, albeit one that left behind the very tools seemingly needed for survival. Very confusing.
Now, approximately a week after Messin disappeared, his mother, Tracy, made another discovery in his room. She found a note folded multiple times and tucked inside Mason's wallet, which she had apparently overlooked in initial searches.
Okay, a note found a week later inside the wallet he left behind.
Yes. The full exact contents of this 3-page, undated note haven't been publicly released. However, the parents have stated that it indicated Macin might harm himself and reportedly contained the phrase, "I'm done."
I'm done. That's heading. And ambiguous. Police reportedly believed Macin didn't necessarily intend for the note to be found right away, given its location folded inside his wallet, possibly missed initially.
This detail is key because it raises an important question. Why hide a suicide note? A typical suicide note is usually left in a prominent place to be found immediately.
Exactly. The hidden location leads to ambiguity. Some alternative interpretations suggest the note might have been less a definitive statement of suicidal intent and more of a final telling off to his parents. A reflection that he was done with his current living situation, his relationship with them, or their roles, rather than being done with life itself.
This note and the circumstances surrounding its discovery and partial disclosure are highly ambiguous. The parents' selective disclosure of its contents, while maybe an understandable desire to protect privacy, creates a vacuum for interpretation and speculation.
Definitely.
It leaves the meaning wide open to whether it was a suicide note, an angry farewell note, or something else entirely.
It suggests the phrase, "I'm done," could be read in multiple ways. I'm done with this life, meaning suicide, or I'm done with you, or this situation, meaning he intended to leave them behind to start a different life.
Right.
And the delayed discovery, whether Macin intended for it to be found later or Tracy simply missed it, significantly impacted how the case was initially perceived and investigated. It potentially pushed the narrative towards suicide or self-harm based on the parents' interpretation, even if that wasn't the note's sole or primary intent.
It just added another layer of uncertainty and complex emotional context to an already perplexing disappearance. Let's turn now to the investigation itself and the extensive search efforts that followed Macin's disappearance. Initially, as we mentioned, police classified Macin's case as a runaway when the report was filed on September 1st, 2015.
The St. George Police Department officially still lists it as an active missing persons investigation on their records. However, as our sources detail and we touched on earlier, court documents reveal a different, more complex picture of the investigation's scope.
Yeah.
Detectives have been actively exploring criminal homicide, seeking evidence for such crimes through search warrants.
This tension between the official classification and the investigative actions looking for evidence of murder while calling it an active missing persons case is really key to understanding the underlying ambiguity that investigators face. To add another layer, the Utah BCI, that's the Bureau of Criminal Investigation for the state, lists Macin as missing, but explicitly labels his case as a cold case.
So you have different law enforcement entities classifying the case slightly differently, reflecting that deep uncertainty about whether Macin is simply missing, whether he took his own life, or whether foul play was involved. It's messy.
What were some of the specific police actions taken early on, as detailed in our sources? Investigators conducted a thorough search of Macin's laptop. Beyond the extensive anime artifacts, they reportedly uncovered a Word document that talked about Macin trying to kill himself, providing some potential insight into his state of mind.
Okay, that's
And
significant.
then those searches for anime pornography?
This digital evidence provides crucial clues into Mason's internal world and struggles leading up to his disappearance, which is vital when there's no body, no crime scene, and no physical evidence of what happened.
They also served numerous warrants for his cell phones, laptops, social media accounts, gaming consoles, basically anything that might hold clues about who he was talking to, what he was researching, or where he might have planned to go.
Standard procedure, but necessary. And they rigorously followed up on reported sightings. Our sources mention possible sightings tracked down by investigators in several states, including Nevada, Las Vegas, California, Modesto, Sacramento, and even potentially as far as Argentina.
Argentina, wow. Okay. None of these sightings, however, despite being pursued, have ever been officially confirmed as Mason.
And that's a huge point.
Yeah. This lack of any credible confirmed sighting over the years is a major challenge for the runaway theory. Despite widespread attention, news coverage, and a standing reward, no one has been able to definitively place Macin anywhere after September 1st, 2015.
And that's highly unusual for a voluntary runaway, especially one who would ostensibly need to interact with the world somehow to survive. You'd expect to trace somewhere.
St. George Police spokeswoman Tiffany Atkin has provided public statements offering insight into the official police stance and the investigation's trajectory. She stated that from the very beginning, we have overturned every stone, we have researched every lead that we've been given, and we have exhausted all of those.
Okay, so that indicates that there was a period of intense, proactive investigation in the early months, or perhaps first couple of years after he disappeared. They pursued every lead diligently.
But she also clarified the current operational status, stating the case is open, but no one is actively pursuing anything, and they are only investigating new tips as they come in.
Right. This reveals the practical reality of the investigation now. While technically active in status, it has shifted from proactive searching and lead generation to reactive monitoring. All the initial leads and avenues they could explore have been exhausted. They have essentially hit a wall.
So when she says no one is actively pursuing anything, she's clarifying that it's not contradicting the active status on paper, but describing this shift in posture. It's effectively a cold case in practice, waiting for a break, even if the local police department doesn't use that formal term as their primary description.
Exactly. This highlights the profound difficulties in cases where there's no body, no crime scene, no physical evidence of what happened. The investigation is essentially in a holding pattern, entirely reliant on a breakthrough piece of information, which is most likely to come from a public tip at this point.
Atkin also stated that no one in the investigation is currently considered a suspect. However, she added that detectives believe there are persons of interest who may possess more information about the case.
Okay.
She specifically noted that Darren Smith, Mason's father, is not considered a suspect per se, and described him as a cooperative family member.
So, while the intense focus on the parents, which we'll definitely get into shortly, certainly led to serious consideration of foul play potentially involving them, the official police stance currently is that no one has been formally identified as a suspect. But the persons of interest category leaves the door open to individuals who the police believe might have more knowledge or information than they've shared, whether intentionally or unintentionally. It's a subtle but important distinction.
Beyond the official police work, there have been significant and tireless search efforts spearheaded by Mason's family and a dedicated community of volunteers. Immediately after his disappearance, the family initiated their own searches, distributed flyers throughout the area, and organized search parties. With substantial support from their local LDS church community, that's the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a strong presence in Utah.
Professional search organizations also stepped in to assist. Groups like Red Rock Search and Rescue, or RRSR, based in Las Vegas, provided invaluable help with large-scale organized searches in the rugged St. George outskirts, and even extended those efforts into areas around Las Vegas where there were those unconfirmed sightings.
These efforts included extensive wilderness searches across really challenging terrain, even involving equestrian teams and 6 specialized cadaver dogs brought in all the way from California.
6 cadaver dogs. That's a serious resource commitment.
It really is. But tragically, despite these exhaustive efforts covering vast areas, None of these searches yielded any signs of Macin or any physical evidence related to him.
Yeah.
Nothing.
Nothing. A large volunteer search involving about 100 local people was also conducted in 2018, years after he initially disappeared, demonstrating the remarkable, sustained community effort to find answers. People didn't give up.
No, absolutely not. There's one specific incident related to the searches that, while ultimately inconclusive, really illustrates the raw hope, the desperation, and the grim possibilities the searchers were confronting. In October 2017, over 2 years after Macin vanished, a worn, muddy, XL white T-shirt was discovered snagged on the banks of the Virgin River near St. George.
Okay.
Macin's mother, Tracy, considered it a potential clue, noting that it was Macin's size and he often wore solid white shirts. It was enough to reignite a focused search effort.
You can imagine finding something like that?
Yeah.
The hope it must have sparked.
Oh, yeah. Subsequent searches, fueled by the possibility that this might be connected to Macin, involved volunteers physically entering the cold river, prodding the murky banks and debris for any signs of clothing, personal items, or unfortunately, human remains.
The fact that dedicated searchers were literally wading into the river, pushing sticks into the mud, looking for signs of body, it underscores the grim possibilities they were confronting and the depth of their commitment. It highlights the very real fear among those involved in the search that Macin might have died by suicide or foul play in a remote, perhaps watery environment, and they were searching for a tragic recovery rather than a rescue.
And you can only imagine the emotional toll on these volunteers, searching for a potentially tragic outcome without ever finding closure. Nothing human was ultimately found related to that T-shirt.
Right.
It remains another piece of ambiguity in a case just full of them.
The incident, though unresolved, embodies the challenging reality of these long-term searches, where any small, potentially relevant item can ignite a desperate burst of hope, but the lack of a definitive find just perpetuates the uncertainty and the pain.
Despite the official investigation having shifted into that reactive mode, the advocacy and awareness efforts continue tirelessly, largely driven by Macin's mother, Tracy, and a dedicated community of supporters who call themselves Macin's Army.
Macin's Army.
Independent searches still happen, even if large organized ones stalled during things like the COVID pandemic.
The Help Find Macin Smith Facebook page has been incredibly instrumental. It not only keeps Macin's story visible to a wide audience, generating tips and maintaining interest, but it has also expanded its mission to help other families searching for their missing loved ones.
That's a truly powerful and compassionate legacy born from their own agonizing personal tragedy. They've also used creative awareness campaigns like stamping money with Macin's face and information, producing T-shirts, anything they can think of to keep his name and face out there.
And importantly, there is still that standing $10,000 reward being offered for information leading to his location or whereabouts. That's still active.
This really illustrates the critical role that community-driven efforts play in maintaining momentum and visibility for long-term missing persons cases, especially when official law enforcement resources have been exhausted and become more reactive.
Yeah. It's community advocacy stepping into the gap, refusing to let the case fade away. It's quite remarkable.
Now, this next section, based on our sources, is difficult but absolutely necessary to discuss because it represents a significant part of the police investigation and public scrutiny surrounding this case. From relatively early on, the police focus centered quite heavily on Macin's parents, Tracy and Darren Smith.
Yeah, this is unavoidable. This focus is clearly documented in court records related to the investigation. An affidavit from June 2017, nearly 2 years after Macin disappeared, explicitly states that investigators found discrepancies between what Macin's parents have told police, Red Rock Search and Rescue, and the media.
And these court documents go further, alleging that these perceived discrepancies all point to the fact Tracy and Darren know more information surrounding Macin's disappearance than they have disclosed. That's pretty direct language.
Extremely direct. What's revealing here is how seriously police considered the possibility of parental involvement in a potential death. The search warrants discussed earlier, seeking evidence for the crime or crimes of criminal homicide, were explicitly aimed at investigating this possibility.
Right.
This wasn't just routine questioning of family members. Police were actively investigating the possibility of foul play and considering that the parents might be directly involved or, at the very least, withholding crucial information based on these perceived inconsistencies.
Let's break down some of these key discrepancies that are highlighted in the sources and the explanations the parents have provided in response. We've already discussed the VASA Fitness timeline inconsistency on the morning of September 1st, that conflict between hearing Macin leave at 7:40 a.m. and Darren checking into the gym 10 minutes away at 7:45 a.m.
Right. Darren's acknowledgement of that discrepancy while questioning the gym timestamp in his wife's account is one piece. Tracy's explanation that their initial statements were guesstimates due to the stress and not anticipating an investigation is the other.
And this is where the tension lies. While guesstimates are an understandable human reaction in a crisis, the police, according to the documents, clearly viewed these discrepancies as potentially more than innocent errors. If the foundational timeline provided by the people closest to Macin is unreliable, even unintentionally, it forces investigators to consider uncomfortable alternative scenarios, including that the parents might have knowledge they aren't fully sharing, perhaps to protect themselves or someone else, or simply out of fear or confusion.
It creates a significant challenge to building trust and definitely complicates the investigation. Early investigative opportunities might have been missed because these timelines were initially accepted without the rigorous verification that later exposed the inconsistency.
Another reported discrepancy comes from a retired detective with Red Rock Search and Rescue who was involved in the early searches. He stated that Darren allegedly told him he had never heard Macin on the morning he ran away, and agreed Macin could have gone missing during the night.
Whoa.
Which, if true, contradicted his later statements about seeing Macin getting ready and hearing him in the kitchen and leaving that morning.
That's a pretty significant shift in account, if accurately reported, and it's certainly something investigators would want to understand the reason for.
A December 2016 warrant also alleged that neither parent had initiated contact or called detectives for updates since Macin was initially listed as a runaway back on September 1st, 2015.
Okay. Tracy has countered this point, stating she regularly texted and emailed the lead detective and assumed she would be contacted if there was any significant news or development in the case. So there appears to be a difference in perception regarding communication here, or maybe just expectation.
Could be. And then there's the parents' reported absence from some large early search efforts. Police noted their absence from organized searches on September 26th and 27th, 2015, describing it in documents as not typical behavior exhibited by parents and family of a missing person.
The parents, however, have stated they were explicitly told not to participate in the physical searches by the head of the search operation at the time.
Okay.
They quoted this individual as saying, "I don't want you to be the one that finds Macin," presumably out of concern for their emotional well-being if they were to find a tragic outcome.
That makes some sense.
They also claim that KSL TV video footage from those days actually showed them present at the search base, huddled with other volunteers, despite not being physically out in the field.
So there are conflicting accounts even on whether they were physically present at the search operations at all. This is complex. Due to concerns stemming from these alleged inconsistencies and other investigative leads, investigators reportedly took a pretty aggressive and revealing step. They placed a GPS tracker on Darren Smith's pickup truck for at least 60 days, starting in March 2017.
Wow. A GPS tracker on the father's truck. What is particularly striking and revealing here is the justification listed in the warrant used to obtain permission for this action. It reportedly stated, "I know individuals are known to return to the scene of a crime."
Oof. That statement clearly indicates that at the time, police held a strong suspicion of foul play and were actively considering the possibility of direct parental involvement, possibly in a homicide.
No question.
The police were essentially looking to see if Darren's movements would lead them to a location related to Macin's disappearance or potential death.
While police later softened their public stance, stating that Darren is not currently considered a suspect, though persons of interest still exist, the decision to use a GPS tracker on a parent's vehicle with that specific justification is an incredibly aggressive and revealing investigative measure.
Yeah.
It undeniably demonstrates the intensity of their initial suspicion regarding a potential homicide scenario, with Darren being a central figure of interest.
The parents stated they were unaware of the GPS monitoring until much later, but welcomed it, believing that it would ultimately prove their innocence and clear their names.
Their willingness to be monitored, once aware, does support their claim of innocence and transparency, but it also underscores the immense pressure and suspicion they were under from law enforcement due to those perceived inconsistencies.
The lack of any findings from the GPS tracker didn't lead police to any new evidence or a potential location. Doesn't solve the case, but it does eliminate one aggressive avenue of investigation. It didn't provide the breakthrough police were hoping for, leaving the questions and suspicions, perhaps unproven, still lingering for some observers and online communities.
On another investigative front, both Darren and Tracy voluntarily took polygraph tests in relation to the case. Tracy claims that both of them passed their tests, and Darren specifically stated publicly that he passed one he took with an independent contractor.
Okay. However, the St. George police have not publicly confirmed the results of any polygraph tests, citing the need to protect the integrity of the ongoing investigation.
So, again, ambiguity. Adds yet another layer of uncertainty around this specific piece of information, leaving its outcome uncertain for the public. We don't know if they passed from the police perspective.
And then there's the profound and heartbreaking divergence in the parents' deeply held beliefs about their son Macin's fate. Tracy has consistently maintained her belief, publicly and privately, that Macin is alive somewhere.
Holding on to hope.
In stark contrast, Darren has stated his belief that Macin is deceased, often publicly implying that he believes Macin ended his own life by suicide.
Wow. That fundamental and heartbreaking disagreement about the outcome of their son's disappearance, coupled with reports in our sources stating that Mace's disappearance was cited as a primary cause of their divorce in August 2018. It vividly illustrates the devastating psychological impact of what is known as ambiguous loss.
Okay, let's take a moment to unpack that term ambiguous loss because it feels incredibly relevant and important to understanding the enduring pain in this case.
Yeah, it really does. Ambiguous loss refers to a loss that occurs without closure. It's different from a death where there's a body, a funeral, a defined endpoint to grief.
Right.
In Macin's case, because his status is unknown, is he alive or dead? Is he gone voluntarily, or was something terrible done to him? The loss remains undefined, unresolved. This lack of definition prevents a shared grieving process for the family.
That makes so much sense, and it's just heartbreakingly difficult to contemplate. How can parents grieve together, support each other through the loss, when one believes their child is still out there somewhere, perhaps needing their help, and the other believes he is tragically gone forever?
It is incredibly difficult. The inability to define the loss, to have a shared reality of what happened, makes true healing and moving forward as a family unit almost impossible. Each parent's belief, while contradictory, is often a psychological coping mechanism they've developed to try and process an unbearable uncertainty.
Yeah.
This case really highlights the unique and destructive nature of ambiguous loss on a family, creating deep emotional fissures and, as reported, contributing to the breakdown of Macin's parents' marriage.
It's a devastating ripple effect of the unresolved mystery, showing how the simple absence of answers can shatter the very foundation of a family. So, with all of this background, the details of his life, the events of the morning, the items left behind, the ambiguous note, and the complex investigation with its focus on the parents and their discrepancies, several theories have understandably emerged about what happened to Macin Smith. It's important to understand each one, along with its supporting evidence and the significant questions it still raises.
Absolutely. One of the reasons this case remains so perplexing is that there is no single theory that perfectly aligns with all the known facts without leaving major questions unanswered.
The first theory, and perhaps the initial assumption, is the runaway theory. The core idea here is that Macin deliberately left home to escape his circumstances, the pressures, the rules, the tensions, and intended to start a new life somewhere else.
The supporting evidence for this theory is quite strong initially. He had that documented history of running away in 2013 when faced with academic pressure and electronics confiscation, showing a pre-existing tendency to use physical escape as a coping mechanism.
Right. The immediate trigger for his departure was the electronics confiscation, which we've analyzed as a plausible, critical tipping point for someone reliant on those devices for escape and connection. And he had reportedly mentioned a long-held fantasy of running off to California to become a beach bum, suggesting a destination and a desired different life.
And crucially, his deliberate actions right before disappearing also strongly support a planned departure. Deleting his computer's search history is a clear effort to avoid being traced. Hiding his school books under clothes suggests an intent to delay discovery, buying himself time for a getaway.
While he left behind essential items like his wallet, ID, and passport, proponents of this theory might argue this was a deliberate act to sever all ties and make himself untraceable, truly starting over with no past identity markers.
Or maybe he had cash stashed elsewhere and planned to get new ID later. You could argue that. And there have been numerous unconfirmed sightings reported over the years, even if none were ever verified.
Plus, his mother, Tracy, and many online commentators who follow the case firmly believe he simply wanted a different life and left to escape his difficult home environment rather than ending his life.
However, there is significant contradictory evidence and challenging questions for the runaway theory. The most prominent is the complete lack of any confirmed sightings in the years since he disappeared.
That's the big one.
Yeah, despite widespread media attention, a substantial reward, and his face being shared extensively online and on missing persons networks, no single credible sighting has ever been verified by police.
It also raises serious practical questions. How would a shy, introverted 17-year-old, leaving behind all identification documents and likely most of his money, survive independently long-term without interacting with anyone or accessing resources in a way that would leave a trace?
Exactly. His personality doesn't immediately lend itself to successfully living off the grid or blending seamlessly into a new community without any means of identification or income. It seems difficult.
The second theory is suicide. The core idea here is that Macin, struggling significantly with documented depression and feeling overwhelmed, tragically ended his life shortly after leaving home.
This theory is supported by powerful psychological evidence. He had a documented history of significant depression and a prior suicide attempt at age 15 that required hospitalization. This shows a clear vulnerability and a past inclination toward self-harm when in distress.
The note found in his wallet, which his parents stated indicated he might harm himself and contained the phrase, "I'm done," is also strong evidence in this direction, particularly if interpreted as, "I'm done with life."
Mhm. And the word document found on his laptop, referencing a suicide attempt, further supports that he was contemplating this possibility.
His father, Darren, publicly believing Macin is deceased, often implying suicide as the outcome, also aligns with this theory. And law enforcement statements, citing the notes found and the complete lack of tips and sightings, have reportedly concluded he is probably deceased.
But here again, there are significant challenges and unanswered questions. The biggest hurdle for the suicide theory is the complete absence of a body or any definitive physical evidence of suicide, despite extensive and organized ground and river searches involving professional teams and cadaver dogs.
Where is he, if that's what happened?
Exactly. If the note was intended as a suicide note, its hidden location in his wallet, missed for a whip, is perplexing. A typical suicide note is usually left in a prominent place to be found immediately, explaining the person's final actions. Why hide it?
And Mason's actions of hiding his school supplies seem inconsistent with an immediate intent to end one's life that morning. If you plan to die within hours of leaving home, you typically don't take steps to delay people realizing you're gone or that you won't be returning to school. It doesn't quite fit.
So, while there are clear psychological factors, a history of vulnerability, and potential suicide-related notes and documents supporting this theory, the complete lack of physical evidence to back it up creates significant doubt and prevents closure.
The third theory is foul play. This suggests that Macin was a victim of a crime shortly after leaving or being removed from his home.
The strongest support for this theory comes directly from the police investigation itself. As we discussed, court documents show detectives actively exploring criminal homicide and seeking evidence for such a crime through search warrants. That wasn't just a whim.
No. The alleged discrepancies in the parents' statements and actions, which police documented as leading them to believe the parents know more, fueled this suspicion and investigation into potential foul play. And the highly aggressive investigative measure of placing a GPS tracker on Darren's truck with that warrant justification about returning to a crime scene indicates how seriously police considered the possibility of potential parental involvement in a homicide scenario at one point in the investigation.
Another piece of potential evidence, though unconfirmed and debated, is a report that a neighbor saw Macin walking in the neighborhood at 3:50 South p.m. on the day he disappeared.
Okay, that's interesting.
If that sighting is accurate, that's a big if, it would mean he was alive hours after his parents believed he had left for school that morning, opening a crucial window for possible external involvement in a crime occurring outside the home.
Our sources also mention unsubstantiated speculations circulating online about the involvement of the mob, the Mormons, and the fundamentalist Mormon polygamists in a cover-up.
Right.
It's crucial to note, as stated in the sources, that this speculation is entirely unsubstantiated rumor and conjecture, lacking any credible evidence whatsoever. We mention it only because it was present in the source material regarding online discussions surrounding the case, not because it has any basis in fact or evidence.
Yeah, important disclaimer. On the other hand, the significant challenges to the foul play theory are the complete lack of any direct evidence of abduction, struggle, or violence ever found at the home, the bus stop, or anywhere in the extensive search areas.
Right. Nothing concrete. Police currently state no one is formally identified as a suspect, although persons of interest still exist.
The parents vehemently deny any involvement in foul play and claim to have passed polygraph tests, though police have not publicly confirmed the polygraph results.
Hmm.
And despite extensive searches covering vast areas, including those with cadaver dogs specifically trained to find human remains, no body or any physical evidence of a crime has been found.
So while police certainly considered this possibility based on perceived inconsistencies and the lack of other answers, the complete lack of direct evidence or confirmed suspects makes it a challenging theory to substantiate definitively.
It really is.
So here we are. Years later, the disappearance of Macin Smith remains an unresolved and deeply perplexing mystery that haunts the St. George community and anyone who learns his story.
His background, his documented struggles with depression, his history of running away when faced with pressure, and those specific actions he took right before he vanished, deleting search history, hiding books, initially pointed strongly towards either a planned departure or potentially self-harm.
But the complete lack of any confirmed sightings challenges the runaway theory, making it hard to believe he simply vanished into thin air for years without a trace.
Hmm.
And the equally complete absence of any physical evidence, despite extensive and professional searches including cadaver dogs, makes the suicide theory incredibly difficult to confirm, leaving open the possibility that his remains are simply in an unknown location or that something else entirely happened.
The investigation was undoubtedly complicated from early on by the alleged discrepancies found in the parents' accounts and actions, particularly regarding that critical timeline on the morning of September 1st. Those inconsistencies, even if just guesstimates made under stress, led to intense police scrutiny, including the serious consideration of foul play potentially involving the parents, and resulting in aggressive measures like the GPS tracker on Darren's truck, despite police later softening their public stance on suspects.
And as we discussed, the profound and destructive impact of this unresolved mystery on the family is undeniable and heartbreaking. The state of ambiguous loss, with Macin's parents holding starkly different, irreconcilable beliefs about his fate, one believing he is alive, the other believing he is deceased, is a unique kind of pain.
It prevented a shared grieving process and was explicitly cited as a primary cause of their divorce, illustrating how the inability to find closure creates a devastating kind of trauma, leaving them in a perpetual state of limbo, forever searching for answers that may never come.
Officially, the St. George police still classify it as an active missing persons investigation, but their own statements acknowledge they've exhausted all initial leads and are now only investigating new tips that come in. Basically, reactive.
Right. The Utah Bureau of Criminal Investigation, the BCI, is perhaps more direct, explicitly listing Macin's case as a cold case. That's the practical reality of where the investigation stands today. Without a significant new, credible piece of evidence or information, the investigation is essentially in a holding pattern.
But the case hasn't been forgotten. It's kept alive year after year by Macin's mother, Tracy, and that dedicated community of supporters, Macin's Army, through their ongoing advocacy, their online presence, and continued independent efforts to raise awareness and generate tips.
Their work is a powerful and inspiring example of how community action, driven by love and a desperate need for answers, can maintain visibility and momentum for these incredibly difficult, long-term cold cases, even expanding to support other families experiencing similar pain and uncertainty. It's really something.
Ultimately, without that breakthrough information, a confirmed sighting, a credible tip about his whereabouts, or the discovery of physical evidence, the disappearance of Macin Smith seems destined to remain one of Utah's most enduring and tragic cold cases. It's a stark and painful testament to the profound challenges faced by law enforcement and families when someone simply vanishes without a trace, leaving behind a web of conflicting clues and unanswered questions.
It leaves us, and everyone following the case, with that fundamental, aching question. What truly happened to Macin Smith on the morning of September 1st, 2015?
So what does this deep dive all mean for you listening? You've heard the details, the inconsistencies, the competing theories that try to make sense of this profound absence. What aspects of Macin's case stand out to you the most?
Yeah.
What makes it feel so incredibly difficult to find answers or lean definitively towards one theory over another?
Think about the concept of ambiguous loss that we discussed, and how the lack of closure in cases like Macin's creates that unique and devastating kind of pain for families. They're left in this perpetual state of limbo, unable to fully grieve, forever searching for answers that may never arrive. How does that impact their lives day to day?
Or consider how the tension between the limits of official investigations, which can only go so far without clear evidence or new leads, clashes with the persistent, hopeful, and often heartbreaking efforts of families and communities like Mason's Army. How does that dynamic shape our understanding of what it truly takes to keep hope alive and pursue justice or simply truth in these long-term missing persons cases? It's a lot to sit with and reflect on.